I worked as a journalist for a small news outlet in the United States, covering stories that often flew under the radar of larger media organizations. But one day, I stumbled upon a story that would change my life forever. I received a call from a former U.S. Marine who had served in the Middle East. He claimed to have information about the true nature of the conflict in the region, information that the U.S. government had been keeping from the public for years. I was skeptical at first, but something about the way he spoke made me believe that he was telling the truth. We arranged to meet in person, and when we did, he told me his story. He had been stationed in a remote part of Iraq where his unit had been tasked with guarding an ancient tomb that was said to contain a powerful entity. At first, he didn't believe any of it, thinking that it was just another urban legend. But as the days went on, strange things began to happen. He told me about the night he saw the entity for the first time. It was a tall, shadowy figure that seemed to be made entirely of darkness. It spoke to him in a language he didn't understand, but the tone of its voice was unmistakably menacing. He and his fellow soldiers tried to shoot at it, but their bullets had no effect. As time went on, the entity began to reveal more of itself to them. It seemed to be able to read their thoughts and emotions, and it used that knowledge to torment them. Some of the soldiers began to have nightmares about the entity, and others reported feeling like they were being watched even when they were alone. But the most disturbing part of Marine's story was what happened to his fellow soldiers. One by one, they began to fall ill, their bodies racked with pain. Some of them became violent, attacking their fellow soldiers for no reason. Others simply wasted away, their bodies becoming emaciated and frail. The Marine himself was one of the lucky ones. He managed to escape the tomb with his life, but not before witnessing things that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He was honorably discharged from the Marines shortly thereafter, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the entity was still out there, waiting for its next victim. I knew that this story was too big to keep to myself, so I began to investigate further. I reached out to other veterans who had served in the Middle East, and I found that many of them had similar stories. They had seen things that defied explanation, things that made them question their own sanity. I tried to bring this story to the attention of the mainstream media, but they weren't interested. They dismissed it as just another conspiracy theory and told me to focus on more realistic stories. But I knew that I had stumbled upon something important, something that could change the way people thought about the conflict in the Middle East. In the end, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I published Marine's story online, and it quickly went viral. People from all over the world reached out to me, sharing their own stories of paranormal experiences in the Middle East. Some of them were terrifying, others were heartbreaking, but all of them were important. Now, years later, I look back on that time with a mixture of pride and regret. I'm proud of what I accomplished and of the people whose stories I was able to share with the world, but I regret the toll it took on my own life. I received death threats and hate mail, and I became paranoid and anxious. I had to change my phone number and move to a new city just to feel safe. But despite all of that, I know that I did the right thing. The truth about what was happening in the Middle East needed to be told, no matter the cost. And I wasn't the only one who felt that way. Other journalists and investigators began to look into the stories that I had shared, and they found evidence to support them. Eventually, the U.S. government was forced to acknowledge that something strange was happening in the Middle East. They released a statement saying that they were investigating reports of paranormal activity in the region, and that they were taking steps to ensure the safety of their soldiers. But for me, that wasn't enough. I wanted the government to admit the full extent of what was happening, to tell the public the truth about the horrors that were being committed in their name. And so I continued to investigate, to dig deeper into the stories that I had uncovered. It wasn't easy. I faced constant opposition from the government and from the mainstream media who still dismissed my findings as baseless conspiracy theories. But I persisted, driven by a need to uncover the truth and to hold those responsible accountable. In the end, I never found all of the answers that I was looking for. The paranormal activity in the Middle East remained shrouded in mystery, and the government continued to deny that anything unusual was happening. But I know what I saw and what I heard, and I will never forget the stories of the soldiers who shared their experiences with me. Years later, I still receive messages from people all over the world thanking me for sharing the stories of the soldiers in the Middle East. They tell me that my reporting helped them to understand what was really happening and that it gave them a new perspective on the conflict. And that, more than anything else, is what makes me proud of the work that I did. I may not have changed the world, but I know that I made a difference in the lives of those who read my words. And for me, that is enough. On a quiet morning in 2008, I was patrolling a dense forest as a park ranger. It was an ordinary day until I stumbled upon an abandoned cabin. It was situated deep in the woods, surrounded by trees that were old enough to have witnessed a century or two. The cabin was in a state of disrepair, with broken windows, a rotting roof, and overgrown weeds that engulfed the front door. I couldn't help but wonder how long it had been abandoned and what kind of history it held. I radioed my colleagues to report my discovery, but they were too far away to respond immediately. I decided to investigate the cabin myself, hoping to find clues about its past. As I pushed open the creaky door, the musty smell of old wood filled my nostrils. It was dark inside, but I could see a few old chairs and tables in the living room. I took a few steps forward, and suddenly the door behind me slammed shut. I tried to open it, but it was stuck. Panic set in as I realized that I was trapped in the cabin. I reached for my radio to call for help, but it was dead. I was alone, in the middle of nowhere, with no way out. As the sun began to set, the temperature dropped, and the wind started to howl outside. Strange noises echoed from the walls, and I heard footsteps coming from the attic. I knew I wasn't alone anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way up the stairs, my heart racing with fear. The attic was dark, and the air was thick with dust. I shone my flashlight around, and my heart skipped a beat when I saw an old rocking chair moving on its own. It was as if someone was sitting on it, rocking back and forth. But there was no one there. Suddenly, a cold breeze blew past me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned around, and a ghostly figure appeared before me. It was a woman in a long white dress, her hair disheveled and her eyes hollow. I froze in terror, unable to move or speak. The woman started to whisper in a language I couldn't understand. Her voice was low and haunting, and her breath was cold as ice. She pointed to a corner of the attic, and I saw an old trunk covered in cobwebs. I mustered up the courage to walk towards it and opened it with shaking hands. Inside, I found an old diary dated back to the early 1900s. It belonged to a woman who used to live in the cabin with her husband and daughter. They were murdered by a group of bandits who were after their land. The woman's ghost appeared to me because she wanted me to find her diary and uncover the truth about their tragic fate. As I read through the diary, tears welled up in my eyes. I couldn't believe the horror that had taken place in the very cabin I was trapped in. I stayed in the cabin that night, reading through the diary and paying my respects to the family that had lost their lives so tragically. The next morning, my colleagues arrived and found me safe and sound. I told them about my experience, but they didn't believe me. They thought it was just my imagination running wild. Years have passed since that fateful day, but I'll never forget the horror I experienced in the cabin in the woods. I still work as a park ranger, and every time I patrol those woods, I can't help but feel a sense of unease. The spirits of the murdered family still haunt that cabin, and I know I'll never be able to forget them. I was a park ranger at Rocky Mountain National Park, tasked with patrolling the vast, rugged expanse of wilderness and ensuring the safety of the many hikers and campers who visited each year. I had seen my fair share of strange occurrences over the years, but nothing could have prepared me for the events that unfolded when a group of 5 hikers went missing in the summer of 2022. I first received word of their disappearance after they failed to return from a 3-day hike through a remote area of the park. A search party was quickly assembled, and we began to comb the trails and surrounding wilderness for any sign of the missing group. As the days turned into weeks, hope began to fade. We found no trace of the hikers, and their families were left to cope with the devastating possibility that they might never be found. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to their disappearance, something beyond the ordinary hazards of the wilderness. And so, with the official search called off, I decided to continue my own investigation. My search led me to a local historian who shared an unsettling story about an abandoned mine deep within the park. The mine, he said, had been the site of a terrible tragedy decades earlier. A group of miners had become trapped underground after a cave-in, and despite the desperate efforts of their fellow workers, they could not be reached in time. The mine was eventually sealed, leaving the men entombed within its depths. Rumors of strange occurrences and eerie noises had long circulated among the local populace, and many believed that the spirits of the miners still haunted the abandoned tunnels. I was skeptical, but intrigued. Could there be any connection between the mine and the missing hikers? I had to know. And so, armed with a map and a headlamp, I set off into the wilderness to find the mine and uncover its secrets. After several days of arduous hiking, I finally stumbled upon the entrance to the mine, hidden away in a narrow gorge. The wooden beams that once supported the entrance had rotted away, leaving a gaping maw that seemed to beckon me into the darkness. As I ventured into the mine, the air grew colder and the silence more oppressive. I could feel the weight of the mountain pressing down on me, and the shadows seemed to dance and flicker in the beam of my headlamp. Deeper and deeper I delved, the narrow tunnels giving way to larger chambers filled with the rusted remains of mining equipment. It was in one of these chambers that I found the first clue to the hiker's fate. A backpack, torn and weathered, lay discarded in a corner. Inside, I found a wallet belonging to one of the missing hikers. My heart raced as I realized that I was on the right track. But what had brought them here, and what had happened to them? I continued my search, my senses heightened as I strained to hear any sounds that might lead me to the missing group. It was then that I heard it, a faint, garbled whisper echoing through the tunnels. It was impossible to make out the words, but the voice was unmistakably human. I followed the sound, my pulse quickening as the whispers grew louder and more insistent. They seemed to come from every direction, filling the air with a palpable sense of dread. Finally, I reached a chamber that had been hidden away behind a makeshift barricade of rocks and debris. As I cleared the obstruction, the whispers ceased, leaving me in silence once more. The chamber was unlike any I had seen before. The walls were covered in strange swirling symbols, and the floor was littered with the remains of what appeared to be some sort of ritual. And there, in the center of it all, lay the 5 missing hikers. Their bodies were arranged in a circle, each one facing outward, arms outstretched as if in supplication. Their faces were frozen in expressions of terror, and their eyes were wide and unseeing. As I stood there, reeling from the gruesome discovery, the whispers began anew. This time, however, I could understand them. They spoke of a dark pact made in desperation, a bargain struck with the spirits of the mine in exchange for an escape from their earthly tomb. But the price of their freedom had been a heavy one. The spirits demanded the lives of others, innocent souls to take their place in the darkness. The hikers had been their latest victims, lured to the mine by an unseen force and sacrificed to appease the restless spirits. I staggered from the chamber, horrified by the sinister truth I had uncovered. I knew that I had to seal the mine once more, to ensure that no others would fall victim to its malevolent grasp. And so, with a heavy heart, I set to work, constructing a new barricade to block the entrance and contain the spirits within. As I placed the final stone, I could hear their anguished cries echoing through the tunnels, a chilling reminder of the evil that lurked beneath the earth. I emerged from the mine, shaken to my core. The mystery of the missing hikers had been solved, but the price of that knowledge had been steep. I knew that I would never be the same again, that the horrors of that abandoned mine would haunt me for the rest of my days. But for the families of the missing hikers, there was closure. They could finally lay their loved ones to rest, knowing that they had not been lost to the wilderness, but to something far more sinister. As for me, I continued my work as a park ranger, but with a newfound respect for the dangers that lay hidden within the wilds. I knew that there were forces beyond my understanding, things that could not be explained away by science or reason. And so I remained vigilant, always watchful for signs of the darkness that lurked just beyond the safety of the campgrounds and trails. For I knew that in the wilderness, nothing was ever truly as it seemed.